My great-grandfather, James McCracken Senior, came to this shire, this district, in 1883, we understand, and selected land out at Lawlight. His early neighbours were the Hicks family, and he subsequently married one of the daughters of the Hicks family, Margaret Hicks, who became his wife for 60 odd years. Then in 1893, they sold the land at Lawlight and took up the licence here at the commercial hotel. They ran the pub hands-on until 1920 when they retired. However, they held on to the freehold and they built the hotel that you can see here now in 1928. It was built by his son-in-law, Len Smith, and it was built over a period of 6 months, and the grand opening, I understand, was in November 1928. He never traded from this business himself. He let the building, was the lessor, and other people were the proprietors. The freehold of the building, I understand, was sold by his sons, my grandfather James and my great-uncle Henry Gregg McCracken, in 1938, and they continued to farm their farms out around Lullama. Well, there's a fascinating cartoon done by the world-renowned cartoonist Percy Leason, which included this hotel, and I understand that it was connected with the topical subject at the time of Prohibition, and also the referendum that was underway in Victoria at the same period to vote to make it illegal for liquor licences. My understanding was that it was voted down by a factor of about 60% retaining alcohol licences as opposed to 40% who were in favour of liquor licences being banned. I dare say my grandfather naturally would have been voting against the referendum getting up, but of course naturally I never met the man and I don't recall my uncles or my father mentioning anything about that. My grandfather was my great-grandfather, I beg your pardon, was a very civic-minded individual. He sat on council for a period of 30 years, I understand, and was the Shire President for 3 times. My grandfather too was a civic-minded individual. He was a councillor for about 28 years and also was a Shire President 3 times. So the McCrackens have had a long association with the community in the Kaniva, Lullama area, and I'm the 4th generation of the family. This cartoon, like a lot of them, very animated with a lot of detail. The cartoon shows the northern end of the hotel with the actual aspect looking south down across Madden Street and down South Lullama Road. You can see in Commercial Street or Madden Street lots of brewery wagons with casks of wine and beer with Clydesdale horses pulling them, and they all appear to be heading west to South Australia, which I imagine hasn't had this plebiscite and so were perhaps spreading their business risk. But it certainly, like all his cartoons, it had an aspect of wry humour and sarcasm, but it was always observation that had quite a point to it. The wagons too had an aspect that they weren't necessarily beer wagons, and so like America, you could have had sly grog venues opening up everywhere. And for instance, the Bank of New South Wales across the corner, could have had a sly grog outlet, from the basement, or Herdman's or Brown's, as I recall, the 2 supermarkets. Could have been profitably trading alcohol out the back. That was the sort of thing, as I understand it, occurred in America. Yeah, well, there was a section of Melbourne, the eastern suburbs, was a block of Melbourne that actually voted overwhelmingly in favour of banning liquor licences. And so there was, from about this plebiscite in the 1930s till sometime, I understand, in the early 70s, was known as the dry area of Melbourne. And if you go through Camberwell and Hawthorn, you would see of buildings that were obviously corner pubs, trading as other businesses, because naturally they had their licences revoked, because it was decided to make that area dry based on that result from the referendum or plebiscite. And as I understand it, what he'd do is draw on aspects in and around Kaniva and hybridise them to topics that were current during the 1930s. But he used a lot of the buildings that he was familiar with in Kaniva from when he was an adolescent and young man. Well, I mean, I think it was the underlying assumption was it was the demon drink that needed to be banned here. My grandfather was a staunch and active Presbyterian, as indeed all the McCrackens were. So naturally, I don't think he completely subscribed to that theory himself. I mean, he was in the business of serving beer and alcohol. I honestly don't know from the McCracken family point of view. My great uncle and grandfather, father and three uncles were all farmers. Now I can basically recall they grew barley as well as wheat and some oats as a part of their crop rotation. From my understanding, that didn't figure in the McCracken family things. Now, we did have an active Methodist congregation in Kaniva. The church was actually faced the Shire Hall, or the Shire Hall, I should say, actually faced the side of the Methodist church on that corner. And yeah, I have been told anecdotally that the Methodist congregation were encouraged not to grow barley because malting barley was used in the brewing process for beer, and hence why they frowned on just that. It was obviously some of our forebears were very civic-minded, and they worked hard and raised funds to build the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and indeed our neighbours on the farm, the Roaches, who were instrumental in the funding of the construction of the Catholic Church, sadly now recently deconsecrated. But, you know, they were active, civic-minded, hard-working members of their then community. Well, another branch of the McCracken family in Melbourne actually founded a brewery called the McCracken's Brewery, and you'll note that there's a McCracken's Pale Ale and also a number of other bespoke brews that they periodically bring out, a McCracken's Stout. Now, they run a very successful brewery from the 1850s until about 1910, when the Carlton Brewery bought out the McCracken Brewery to form the Carlton and United Brewery. They had some choice property in Lower Collins Street. So I often think, wouldn't it be great if the family had retained some of that land or ownership of it thereof until now? We'd certainly be slightly wealthier than we are. And indeed, they were successful, but however, the two fathers made the money, but the two sons actually spent most of it, the proceeds being Church of England Girls' Grammar in Essendon, which is Lowther Hall, and the Columban Society building in Essendon. The two sons built those substantial mansions. So that fortune sadly now dissipated. Okay. There's a saying that actions speak louder than words. Now, my grandfather and a number of other civic-minded people voted with their feet and their labour and their capital to erect buildings in this pristine environment, starting off with weatherboard buildings. And my grandfather purchased the freehold of this site, which was then a weatherboard structure, in 1893. He subsequently expanded this hotel prior to the construction of the current building to being about a 20-odd bed hotel and accommodation hotel during the very early phase of the 20th century. He subsequently rebuilt or completely rebuilt this hotel into the structure that you see today in 1928, as did other members of this community with various businesses, and he was involved in the Shire Council, who subsequently rebuilt the Shire offices and hall to the magnificent building we now see there today as well. Well, there are a number of other businesses too that grew and developed in parallel with my great-grandfather's hotelier business in the main street that we see today. There was a butcher. There was, I think, a fellow by the name of Bond, who ran a general store and mercantile business. Brown's. It was an involved family who ran not only the stock and station agent, but they also ran the supermarket. In fact, I can remember the Browns trading into my memory. You also had the Herdmans, who ran the haberdashery, and also the Herdman supermarket too, up into my memory. There was someone Barnes the jeweller. You also had Fishers, who had, I think, initially a blacksmith and wagon repair business, who then eventually became the Ford dealer, selling Ford motor vehicles up until my memory, trading from the site adjacent to the old Westpac Bank. The major aspects of a hotelier's business in the 1890s and later in the early part of the 20th century is you had the farmers who would bring their sheep in to the sheep yards, which are at the back of this hotel. Now, naturally, after all that hard, hot work of herding the sheep into the sale yards and selling them, what would you do when you had money in your pocket, burning a hole in your pocket? You'd come next door to the hotel and have a meal and a few cleansing ales. So I think they were a key part of my grandfather's business. But you also had travellers who travelled widely, town to town to town back in the day, via the train. And naturally, after they'd done their business with the storekeepers in the main street here, they'd need to stay somewhere. And my understanding was, as my great-grandfather had accommodation of 20-something rooms, and it must have been quite viable because it was enabled the funding of the purchasing of quite a bit of the land that my grandfather and my great-uncle subsequently farmed on. And of course, you also had the local population of Kaniva itself would have been, customers here as well, for a beer after work before they finished up at what they called the 6 o'clock swill, I think was the term. Yes, this hotel was fortunate in it didn't burn down. It was actually demolished in early 1928 for this structure that we now see to be built. And as I said before, it was built by my great-uncle, Uncle Len Smith. The hotels, as we now know them, ran quite differently. There was the accommodation, which I've just referred to. But for instance, it wasn't the done thing back in the day for ladies to be in the public bar. So ladies, if they entered the hotel and they weren't staying, would proceed to the ladies' lounge, where they may have a cup of tea, or if they're a bit risque, possibly a shandy. And it was a different way of trading because it reflected community norms and attitudes that were in place then. And so, well, if you wanted to be a viable business, you actually had to trade in a way that your local community found acceptable. So, it was just social norms generated commercial imperatives. And there is a picture of the earlier hotel structure with a small cameo shot of my grandfather, and one of the references it makes, and there's a picture of the now new, improved and larger dining room. So that was obviously a part of his business that he was proud of. It expanded his dining facilities, and I dare say, behind every great man, there's usually a woman. I wouldn't have been surprised if my great-grandmother, Margaret McCracken, was actually involved in the running of the dining room. The Roaring Twenties was called the Roaring Twenties with good reason, because it was a period of economic prosperity around the world, around Australia, and indeed in this town. You had structures like this hotel, the Shire Hall, the Church of Christ, and the Bank of New South Wales, now Westpac, built during that period. And it's a testament to the people who raised the funds to build those buildings, and the tradesmen, the builders who built them, still standing proud today. All right. I think back in the day, hoteliers actually had quite lucrative businesses. You had the beer sold across the bar here, and it was a social norm for most men to call into their local hotel, their local, for a beer before they got home for dinner of an evening. Then, of course, you also had the accommodation for the local travellers, commercial travellers, I mean, in addition to people possibly heading interstate, which was a 24/7 concern. And in fact, I do know that my maternal grandfather first came to Kaniva with the railways and stayed in this business, this hotel, on his first night in the town. Little did he know that his daughter was in the future was going to marry his grandson. I hope I've provided a little bit of interesting information for this to be added to the Wiregrass Trail here along the main street, Commercial Street, Kaniva. So I think I'll finish up today with a toast. Cheers, big ears. Down it goes, big nose.